Some crimes are shocking, some crimes are brutal, but some crimes are terrifying. Because they are committed by people who look completely normal. A loving husband, a caring father, a trusted neighbor, but behind that normal face, a dark and dangerous mind was slowly forming. This is not a fictional story. This is a real crime, a real family, and a real murderer. This is the true story of Chris Watts, a case that shocked the United States, a crime that destroyed an entire family, and a man who hid a deadly secret behind a calm smile. Chris Watts lived in Colorado, USA. He appeared to live a perfect family life. He had a beautiful wife, Shanann Watts, and 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. On social media, their family looked happy. They shared smiling photos, family trips, birthday celebrations, and loving moments. To the outside world, they looked like a perfect American family, but behind closed doors, their marriage was struggling. There were financial problems, arguments, emotional distance, and growing tension. Chris began feeling trapped. He felt pressured by responsibilities, family expectations, and personal frustrations. Instead of seeking help, he began living a double life. He started hiding secrets, lying to his wife, and emotionally disconnecting from his children. While his family believed he was a devoted father, his mind was slowly drifting toward a dangerous path. In the months leading up to the crime, his behavior started to change. He became colder, more distant, less affectionate. Friends and family noticed something was wrong, but no one imagined how dark his thoughts had truly become. On the night of August 12, 2018, the Watts family went to sleep like any normal night. Shanann was pregnant with their 3rd child. Their daughters slept peacefully in their beds, but Chris Watts was awake. While his family slept, he was thinking, planning, deciding. The house was silent, the lights were off, the air felt heavy with an unseen tension. Inside his mind, a deadly decision was taking shape. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern American history, and this was only the beginning of a shocking truth that would soon be revealed. The morning after that silent night, Chris Watts contacted the police. He told them his wife and daughters were missing. He claimed he had no idea where they were. Police officers arrived at the Watts family home in Frederick, Colorado. At first glance, nothing appeared broken, no signs of forced entry, no visible struggle. The house looked normal, too normal. Chris greeted the officers calmly. He spoke softly. He appeared worried, but not emotional. Detectives began observing his behavior carefully. Something didn't feel right. A husband whose pregnant wife and 2 small children had vanished should have been devastated, but Chris Watts remained controlled, almost rehearsed. Neighbors were questioned. One neighbor provided security camera footage. The footage showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway. Early that morning, detectives noticed his movements looked unusual. He appeared to be loading items into his vehicle. This raised serious suspicion. Soon, the case caught national media attention. News reporters gathered outside the home. The story spread rapidly across the United States. Chris Watts gave interviews to the media. He pleaded for his family to return home. He said he loved them. He said he wanted them safe. But experts later noted his facial expressions did not match his emotional words. His voice lacked urgency. His eyes showed little genuine fear behind his calm appearance. Pressure was building, and investigators were beginning to uncover the truth that he desperately wanted to hide. As hours passed, police began analyzing his phone records, text messages, and recent activities. Every clue was pointing toward one disturbing possibility. The man reporting his family missing might not be a victim. He might be the person responsible, and soon, Chris Watts would face a psychological pressure that he could no longer escape. As investigators continued their work, they began focusing closely on Chris Watts' behavior. He agreed to speak with police. He agreed to take a polygraph test. At first, he appeared cooperative, polite, calm, but underneath that calm exterior, his anxiety was growing. During questioning, he struggled to maintain his story. Small contradictions began to appear. His timeline didn't match. His explanations felt vague. His details changed with every retelling. Investigators noticed subtle signs of stress. He avoided eye contact. He touched his face repeatedly. His breathing became uneven. Experts in body language later explained these behaviors as signs of deception. Chris claimed his wife had taken the children and left the house, but there was no evidence to support that story. Shanann's phone, purse, and personal belongings were still inside the home. Her car remained parked in the driveway. Everything she needed to leave safely was still there. Detectives now believed this was not a missing persons case. It was becoming a homicide investigation. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Chris Watts began to feel trapped. The walls were closing in. The lies were becoming heavier, and soon he would be forced to confront the truth he had been trying to hide. The next phase would take place inside an interrogation room, where every word, every pause, and every reaction would be recorded, and the real story would begin to unravel. Chris Watts was brought to the police station for a formal interrogation. The room was small, dimly lit, and silent, except for the hum of the overhead light. Detectives sat across from him. Cameras recorded every movement, every glance, and every word. At first, Chris maintained his calm. He smiled politely. He answered questions carefully, but the detectives knew that behavior alone does not prove innocence. They began by asking about the night of August 12th. Chris spoke slowly. He avoided details. He repeated phrases. He deflected key questions. Detectives noticed. He fidgeted in his seat. He licked his lips nervously. His breathing was uneven. They asked about Shanann's location. He claimed ignorance. He insisted she had left with the children voluntarily, but detectives remained skeptical. Evidence inside the home did not support his story. They asked again and again. Chris repeated his story, but small cracks appeared in his version of events. A pen dropped from his hand. He jumped slightly. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He swallowed hard. The detectives leaned in. They kept the pressure subtle, psychological, enough to test his composure. Without overt aggression. Time passed. Minutes turned into hours. The tension in the room was palpable. Chris' carefully rehearsed story was beginning to falter, and with every pause, every hesitation, the detectives moved closer to uncovering the chilling truth behind the disappearance of Shanann and the children. As the interrogation continued, Chris Watts began to show more tension. Detectives asked specific questions about the children. Where were Bella and Celeste? What had happened that night? Chris' responses became slower. He hesitated. He avoided eye contact. Detectives applied psychological techniques. They used silence. They waited. They let the weight of the questions press on him. He shifted in his chair. His hands trembled slightly. His calm demeanor was breaking down. Detectives introduced evidence. They mentioned inconsistencies in his statements. They referenced phone records and neighbor testimonies. Chris tried to explain. He repeated his rehearsed story, but the stress was visible. Hours passed. The tension grew. Each question felt heavier than the last. The detectives watched for micro-expressions, tiny flashes of truth, revealing what he was hiding. Finally, they asked the question that would change everything. Chris, did something happen to your family? A pause. A long, uneasy pause. Chris swallowed hard. He glanced at the cameras, then back at the detectives. The room was silent. Every second counted. Every heartbeat echoed. It was in that moment that the first cracks in his story became undeniable. The psychological pressure was starting to take its toll, and what followed next would reveal the darkest truth of the Watts family tragedy. Under the pressure of questioning Chris Watts, emotions began to surface. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting around the room. Detectives noticed his nervous gestures, tapping fingers, biting lips, and uneasy posture. They reminded him gently, there is no benefit in lying, Chris. The truth will come out eventually. Hours into the interrogation, Chris' rehearsed statements started to crumble. He paused mid-sentence. He corrected himself. He avoided specific details. Detectives introduced another tactic, telling him what they already knew. They referenced the evidence, the phone records, the neighbor statements. Chris' defenses weakened. His voice faltered. For the first time, a glimpse of fear appeared in his eyes. He began to mumble inconsistencies, small admissions. Without realizing, the detectives were carefully noting every word. The room grew heavier with tension. The air felt thick, like every heartbeat was amplifying the fear. At one point, Chris leaned back, rubbing his face. His shoulders slumped. Detectives remained calm, letting him speak, letting him reveal himself. Through his own words, hours passed, the night turned darker, and Chris Watts was approaching a psychological breaking point. The detectives' strategy was working. Every hesitation, every inconsistency, brought them closer to the shocking truth that he desperately wanted to hide. As the interrogation continued, Chris Watts' composure began to crumble further. Detectives asked him to recount the night of August 12th, step by step. He stumbled over details. He hesitated. His eyes avoided contact. His voice shook slightly. They observed micro-expressions, tiny facial movements, that betrayed fear, guilt, and panic. The detectives remained calm, letting him reveal himself. Through his own words, they asked him about the children. Where are Bella and Celeste? Did you hurt them? Chris paused. A long, uneasy pause. Then he muttered vague statements, trying to deflect, but every deflection only made him appear more suspicious. Police detectives gently confronted him with the evidence from the scene, his truck movements, home camera footage, and contradictory statements. The pressure was mounting. Psychologically, Chris was trapped. His lies were collapsing. Under careful observation, hours turned into tension-filled minutes, each question heavier than the last. Then came the pivotal moment. Detectives began to focus on his emotional response. They asked about his feelings for his family, reminding him of the lives at stake. Chris' eyes welled with tears. His hands trembled. For the first time, he was truly confronted with the weight of his actions. The detectives allowed silence, letting him absorb the consequences of his deceit. And as the minutes passed, the psychological walls around him began to collapse. A confession was starting to form in the mind of Chris Watts. Hours into the interrogation, Chris Watts' story was falling apart. The detectives pressed gently but firmly, reminding him, the truth is always better than lies. Your family deserves the truth. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, breathing fast. Sweat formed on his forehead. His voice wavered. Chris began to fumble through excuses, saying things that didn't make sense. He contradicted himself multiple times. Detectives noticed patterns in his speech. Hesitations, pauses, repeated phrases. All signs that deception was collapsing. They asked about the children again. Where are Bella and Celeste? Chris fell silent. His hands clenched. He looked down at the table. For the first time, the mask of calmness was gone. The detectives used a technique called psychological mirroring. They reflected his emotions, highlighting his fear and guilt. Without shouting or accusing, slowly, Chris began to talk about his internal struggle. He hinted at anger, frustration, and a desire to escape responsibility. But he avoided admitting the truth. He spoke vaguely about his feelings, trying to justify his actions. The detectives waited, patiently, silently observing the man sitting before them, who had committed an unthinkable crime. Each question, each pause, brought them closer to the moment when Chris Watts would reveal the horrifying reality of what had happened to his family. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every second felt like hours, and every heartbeat echoed through the small interrogation room. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Finally, the detectives applied the most critical technique, reminding Chris Watts of the evidence they already had. They calmly laid out phone records, security footage, witness statements. Chris' reactions were subtle but telling. His eyes widened, his hands trembled, and he struggled to maintain composure. Detectives then asked the question that would break the final barrier. Chris, did something happen to Shanann and the girls? A long silence followed. Chris' face turned pale. He leaned back in his chair. His body trembled. For the first time, he realized there was no escape. No lies left to protect him. No mask to hide behind. He began to mumble, then stammer. Then, finally, he started to speak the truth. Although only in fragments, he admitted to arguments at home. He admitted frustration and fear. But he avoided the most horrific detail. Detectives remained silent, allowing him to fill in the gaps himself. Chris' emotions escalated. Fear, guilt, and panic intertwined. He spoke faster, tried to justify, then paused abruptly. Every word he uttered was being recorded and analyzed, and as the hours passed, it became clear that the psychological pressure was working. The man who had seemed calm, polite, and in control was now unraveling in front of the detectives. The walls around his lies were collapsing, one brick at a time. The detectives knew the final confession was imminent. Chris Watts finally broke. His voice shook. His eyes welled with tears. He admitted, for the first time, what he had done. He confessed to murdering his wife, Shanann. He confessed to killing his 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. The room was silent. Detectives listened carefully, writing down every word. Chris described, in chilling detail, how the crime had unfolded. How fear, frustration, and desperation had led him to commit the unthinkable. As he spoke, the detectives maintained a calm presence, allowing him to release the weight of his confession. Outside, the world was watching. The media was already reporting on the missing family, and now, the truth was finally being revealed. The psychological unraveling of Chris Watts was complete. He had gone from a calm, smiling husband to a man crushed by guilt and trapped by his own lies. The evidence, combined with his confession, led to his arrest and prosecution. He would be held accountable for the deaths of his family. This case shocked the United States. It reminded the world that even the most ordinary seeming people can harbor extraordinary darkness. But it also highlighted the tireless work of law enforcement, psychologists, and investigators, who never gave up until the truth was uncovered. The Watts family tragedy serves as a chilling lesson. Evil can hide behind a smile, but the truth always finds a way to surface. And as the investigation concluded, one reality remained. The lives of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were lost forever, but their story would be remembered. This is the story of Chris Watts. A story of deception, betrayal, and tragedy. A story that shows the depth of human darkness and the power of truth. Musical note: final music cue. Slow, haunting, emotional cinematic score, Fade OU.